CBAM is to maintaining access into the EU market and staying competitive in a low carbon economy. What exactly is the aim of CBAM? Well, there are three main aims under CBAM. Firstly, to prevent carbon leakages. Second, to contribute to decarbonization. Lastly, to complement and reinforce the EU ETS. Well, as mentioned earlier, the European Union has pledged to become carbon neutral by 2025 and making sure that its industrial sectors such as steel, cement, and aluminium can maintain ethical competitiveness on a worldwide scale while lowering their carbon emissions is a significant obstacle to accomplishing this aim. Hence, CBAM is a tool that is created to make sure that nations with different carbon pricing systems don't unfairly compete with these industries. So the implementation timeline of CBAM is being done in two phases. Firstly, we have the transitional phase, and secondly, the implementation phase. The transitional phase began on October 1st, 2023. This is where exporters and importers will only be asked to report their emissions calculations and their emissions data. At this point, certificates are not necessary. Whereas from January 1st, 2026, the implementation phase will begin. And here it will become necessary for exporters and importers to report their emissions data as well as purchase and surrender CBAM certificates. There have been some talks of CBAM officials moving the implementation phase 1 year ahead to 2027. However, till now, CBAM officials or the EU Commission has not made any statement on this. So let me now talk to you about the key compliance requirements for importers and exporters. This slide will explain the key requirements that are needed for the compliance process for importers and exporters. Well, mainly CBAM reporting falls under importers who import products into the EU. However, some parts of the compliance process will apply to the exporters as well. As I move on, I will keep making sure that you know exactly what process needs to be done by whom. So firstly, we have the registration process. The registration process will be done by the importers of CBAM covered goods, and they must register with the CBAM authorities. And it is important to register in order to ensure smooth trade operations and legal compliance. And I would recommend that this be done before importing goods into the EU to avoid any kind of penalties. Secondly, we have the reporting emissions. These emissions will be reported by the exporters. However, these emissions will be measured and disclosed by the importers. This is by the exporters. So this is where the exporters come in. These reports will be submitted by the exporters to the importers, and all the calculation will be done by the exporters. Moving on, we have the CBAM certificates, which are basically a pricing mechanism that account for the CO2 emissions of imported goods. And importers will purchase CBAM certificates. Again, I would like to clarify that exporters will have nothing to do with this. It will actually be the importers that will have to purchase and surrender these CBAM certificates to cover the carbon footprint of their goods. And if they do not comply, there will be risk of penalties, trade restrictions, and legal consequences. I want to now talk to you about exactly who are the key stakeholders in CBAM. Well, there are 5 main key stakeholders, and these are the authorized CBAM declarants, exporters, customs authorities, the European Commission, and lastly, the national competent authorities. Well, let me tell you about each of these in detail for more understanding. CBAM declarants will play a crucial role in the CBAM administration process. The authorized CBAM declarant is basically the importer who will be responsible for submitting necessary information to the customs authorities and the NCAs for complying with the reporting and financial obligations. As from 2026, importers will need to apply for an authorized CBAM declarant status through the NCA. Moving on, we have the exporters. Well, exporters are basically the companies or entities that sell and ship goods from one country to another, supplying products to international markets, including the EU. Exporters, however, are not directly responsible for CBAM compliance. Their role is crucial because CBAM applies to the carbon emissions embedded in the goods that are imported into the EU. Since EU importers must report these emissions and pay for CBAM certificates, exporters will be playing a key role in providing accurate emissions data. This is one of the main steps of the compliance process. Moving on, we have the customs authorities, which are basically the entities that are entitled to carry out checks on the goods imported, and they ensure that the company importing these goods are authorized CBAM declarants, aka importers. So the custom authorities inform the importers and the indirect customs representatives of their reporting obligations, and each country part of the EU will have its own customs authority. This authority will manage the registration process for importers, issue certificates, and verify emissions data. Then we have the European Commission. Well, the European Commission has a central role in the administration of CBAM, and this commission will set the overall framework, rules, and guidelines related to this implementation. For this purpose, a CBAM transitional registry has been developed and is managed by the Commission. Before the end of the transitional period, the Commission will use this information that is being reported for general analysis so that they can further specify and finalize the methodologies of calculation as well as find synergies with existing monitoring schemes. Lastly, we have the national competent authorities, the NCAs, and each EU member state will have an important role in implementing CBAM within their respective jurisdictions. Well, in 2025, the competent authorities are responsible for granting the authorized CBAM declarant status. And as from 2026, they will also oversee the purchase and surrender of the certificates. They will also be the ones who will be enforcing the obligations based on the review by the European Commission. And they will work in close coordination with the Commission as well as the customs authorities and also the authorized CBAM declarants. I will now break down the CBAM reporting process step by step. So as I mentioned earlier, there are three main steps for compliance. The first one is the registration process. The second one is the calculations, and the third one is the certificates. We will now look into the first compliance step, which is the CBAM registration process for importers. Again, at this point, I would like to tell you that exporters are not supposed to register. It is only the importers importing goods into the EU that will need to register with CBAM officials. So CBAM compliance is essential for all businesses that are importing goods into the EU. And the customs authorities will play a central role in enforcing this. Importers will use an online portal to declare these emissions of imported products that will be reported by the exporters. So in the transition phase, this process only focuses on data collection, as mentioned earlier. And this will allow the EU to refine methodologies and data accuracy. In this phase, importers do not have to purchase certificates, but will only need to report emissions. And the reason why CBAM is being implemented in two phases is so that companies within the EU and outside the EU can get used to this new mechanism and learn how to be compliant. Take you through the rest. Firstly, the first step would be to access the CBAM declarant portal. Secondly, would be to register with the UUMNDS. So basically, the UUMNDS is the Uniform Management and Signature Digital Signature System that is within the EU, and it provides an authentication framework and a one single entry point for the customs authorities. And in order to move on to the next steps, you must authenticate via the UUMNDS. The next step for the importer would be to log into the system. And this seems like a simple step, but it is critical as users often face access errors due to incorrect credentials or incomplete registration. So without completing this step, again, you will not be able to move on. The fourth step would be to become an authorized CBAM declarant through the NCA. So I'm sure everybody's wondering as to how you can find these NCAs. Well, the European Commission and CBAM officials have made a provisional list of national competent authorities, and this is available and documented and available on the CBAM official website. The last step would be to start the CBAM reporting. So to wrap this up, I would just like to say that CBAM compliance is a multi-step process requiring careful registration, authentication, and reporting. Resources Future is here to help businesses understand these challenges seamlessly. So if you need any assistance with CBAM reporting, verification, or compliance strategies, please feel free to reach out to us and we can work together to ensure smooth trade operations and full CBAM compliance. So how is CBAM reporting done? Well, we have now come to the crux of it all. And CBAM reporting is not just about compliance. It's about securing market access and staying ahead in the global carbon neutral economy today. With the right approach and support, businesses can turn CBAM compliance into a competitive advantage. And Resources Future here just wants to ensure that you are fully prepared for this when it becomes a mandatory requirement for all relevant exports and imports into the EU, such as textiles even. So CBAM reporting basically requires exporters at this point to calculate and declare the carbon emissions embedded in the products. The goal here is to ensure that imported goods are held to the same climate standards as those produced in the EU. We will also look into what kind of emissions need to be reported to follow compliance regulations, as incorrect or incomplete data can lead to penalties or rejected reports. Well, for each import, importers must calculate the embedded carbon content. This can be complex since different production methods and energy sources are used for each product and their influence of carbon intensity. At this point, I'd just like to remind you that it is the exporters that will need to do these calculations at their end and report these on a quarterly basis to the importers. Well, what exactly are embedded emissions? Embedded emissions are what need to be calculated under the CBAM framework, and they refer to the total greenhouse gas emissions related that are released throughout the entire life cycle of a product, from raw material extraction to the production, transportation, and in some cases, even the disposal. As you can see, equals to direct emissions plus indirect emissions. And this carbon content calculation is one of the most complex and important aspects of CBAM. Hence, exporters will really have to know and work their way around calculating these emissions. These emissions are calculated for goods that are simple goods and complex goods. Well, simple goods are produced using input materials with zero embedded emissions, meaning that their emissions calculations will only consider production-related emissions. Whereas complex goods incorporate materials that have embedded emissions from an earlier stage of production. And CBAM will require these upstream emissions of scope 3 to be included in the final product's carbon footprint. So under CBAM, there are actual emissions as well as default emissions. Actual emissions refer to the verified real emissions that are generated during the production of imported goods, which are calculated based on direct data from the producers. Whereas default emissions are preset values provided by the EU representing the average emissions for a given product type and country when actual data is unavailable. Let me just give you an interesting fact here that using actual emissions will often result in lower CBAM costs as default values tend to be higher to encourage precise reporting. So why is it that accurate emission calculation matters so much? Well, CBAM requires importers to report embedded carbon emissions in line with the recognized international standards. And to ensure compliance, this means using globally accepted methodologies for emissions tracking. So there are two main standards that are currently being used. We firstly have the ISO 14641. This basically is a framework that is recognized globally and is a standard for GHG accounting and verification. This provides a framework for quantifying and reporting emissions at an organizational level while also ensuring transparency and consistency in emissions calculations and reporting. We then have the GHG protocol, which is the most widely used emissions accounting tool currently. This basically defines methodologies for calculation emissions across three scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3, which we will discuss further ahead in detail. So essentially, for businesses, it is important that when they are seeking CBAM compliance and aligning with sustainability goals, that they only use globally accepted calculation methodologies. And adhering to these standards will ensure consistency, transparency, and accuracy in their emissions reporting while facilitating compliance with CBAM requirements. For CBAM reporting, embedded emissions specifically focus on scope 1, 2, and scope 3, but from scope 3, they only focus on the upstream emissions. You will understand this once I explain scope 3 in detail. And it is highly likely that all of scope 3 will be involved in CBAM calculations in the near future. What exactly is scope 1? Scope 1 includes direct GHG emissions from sources that are owned or directly controlled by the company. These emissions generally result from activities in company facilities, vehicles, or industrial processes. An example of this would be a steel factory burning coal to produce steel emits scope 1 emissions. A second example of this would be Tesla's in-house vehicle manufacturing, resulting in direct emissions from factory operations. Moving on, scope 2 is basically the indirect emissions that come from the generation of purchased electricity, such as steaming, heating, or cooling, that a company consumes but does not produce itself or is not directly in control of. So these emissions occur at the power plant, but the company using the energy is responsible for reporting them. An example, a very good example of this actually would be Google and Microsoft. So as we know, Google and Microsoft have massive data centers at, that require large amounts of electricity, and this, ahead results in scope 2 emissions from the power plants supplying this energy. A second example of this would be, for example, Walmart or any other grocery store that we can think of that uses electricity for lighting, refrigeration, and heating to run its stores. So now we move on to scope 3. Scope 3 is the largest category and includes the value chain as well as the supply chain emissions. Scope 3 is further divided into upstream and downstream. At the moment, only upstream emissions are included in CBAM calculations. Well, Scope 3 emissions are the indirect emissions that occur in a company's entire value chain, including suppliers, transportation, raw material extraction, product use, manufacturing, and disposal. These emissions is important to keep in mind that they do not come from assets or directly controlled that are directly controlled by the company, but rather linked to its operations. An example of scope 3 would be Amazon. Well, Amazon's scope 3 emissions come from the production of products that it sells on its platform and the emissions from third-party delivery services. A second example of scope 3 would be, for example, a shoe company, or for example, let's take Nike. So Nike's scope 3 emissions will include carbon released in textile production, shipping, and customer product use. The carbon border adjustment mechanism sets a framework for carbon pricing at the EU border, which we will discuss ahead. To comply with CBAM regulations, businesses must accurately calculate and report embedded emissions for imported goods. This slide highlights the 4 key steps in the CBAM reporting process. The first one here would be identifying the emission sources. Businesses at this point need to map out all emission sources across production processes. This will include scope 1, 2, and 3. Number 2 would be to collect and apply the methodologies. Here, companies must gather relevant emissions data, and this should be done using the recognized standards that we discussed earlier, such as ISO 140641 and GHG protocol. So here, if you are leveraging structured data collection methods and also use expert guidance, this can help you streamline this process while reducing errors and efficiencies. Step 3 would be to convert to CO2 equivalent. So once this data is collected, it must be converted to CO2 equivalent for consistency purposes. The only kind of harmful gas is not CO2, but there are other gases such as methane and nitrous oxide, etc. So for easier calculation purposes, all of these gases will be converted into CO2 equivalent and then calculated under the scopes. The last step would be to submit these quarterly reports to the importers. So the exporters will collect this data and then give this accurate data to the importers for reporting ahead. And these reports must include details on embedded emissions per product, and CBAM certificate requirements should be followed. So here I would like to say that timely submission will help avoid penalties and also ensure smooth trade operations. A streamlined reporting process can help businesses stay ahead of compliance requirements and minimize financial exposure. So Resources Future here also offers tailored solutions to simplify CBAM compliance and reporting. If you would like to learn how, please again, feel free to reach out to us through email or LinkedIn, and we can help you support your transition journey. I want to now talk to you about the verification process. Well, CBAM compliance doesn't stop at just reporting. Verification is a critical next step to ensure accuracy, transparency, and alignment with EU ETS. Well, the verification process will ensure that the reported emissions data is credible, standardized, and free from miscalculations. If you are unable to verify your data, then there will be risk of financial penalties, loss of market access, higher CBAM costs, as well as trade restrictions. Let me take you quickly through the verification process. This involves three main steps. Firstly, you have to ensure data accuracy, and this means that companies must submit data that accurately reflects their product uh, processes. And verifiers here will check for errors, inconsistencies, and missing data. Step two would be the third-party verification process. So basically, CBAM requires that emissions data should be reviewed by a independent third-party auditor, aka the verifier. These verifiers will assess whether the data that is reported follows the EU-approved methodology. The third and final step would be compliance with the EU regulations and submission of reports. The EU mandates very strict verification requirements to prevent underreporting or greenwashing. Non-compliance, again, would result in fines, supply chain disruptions, or increased CBAM costs. Let me now take you through the reporting process. Well, the reporting process, again, will need to be reported by the importers, but it is up to the exporters to accurately measure their data, the data on emissions, and report this to the importers. The first step would be the technical setup, under which we suggest that you implement an automated system to help ensure that your data is accurately being collected. Step two would be the data collection and to record emissions of each product systematically. Step three would be the monitoring of data. So over here, I would like to say that an MRV system should be set up to monitor data collection and ensure, accuracy. Step four would be to calculate emissions, and these emissions can, can be calculated based on the CN product codes. These product codes can be found on CBAM's official website. Step five would be to start the report generation and keep it comprehensive based on the data collected. This is what the National Transitional Registry looks like that I mentioned earlier, and only the authenticated CBAM declarants will be able to access this website and report their emissions from here. If you do not have your authenticated CBAM declarant status, you will not be able to access this portal. Moving on, I'd like to talk to you about exactly how the pricing framework for CBAM works. So starting in 2026, importers that will be bringing goods into the EU will need to purchase CBAM certificates. These certificates will ensure that the imported goods reflect the same carbon pricing as EU-produced goods, preventing carbon leakage. So the price determination of CBAM certificates is basically that the cost of CBAM certificates is is directly linked to the price of carbon in the EU under the EU ETS. This is how the EU ETS is connected to CBAM. And this dynamic pricing ensures that imported goods face a comparable carbon cost to EU manufactured products. Well, there are three main principles for CBAM pricing. and I will discuss each one in detail. Firstly, we have the CBAM certificates, which are basically the instruments that the importers will use to pay for the price of emissions embedded in the products that they are importing into the EU. Each year from 1st January 2026, importers known as CBAM declarants will have to buy and surrender CBAM certificates that correspond with the embedded emissions in their products. Number two is the price of these certificates. Well, the price of these certificates will reflect the previous week's average auction price of EU ETS allowances, which will be expressed in euros per ton of CO2 emitted. Moving on, we have the carbon price in developing countries. So, as no reporter shall be charged twice for the same emissions, it is essential that the element that the importers can, claim a reduction of these CBAM certificates up to any level of carbon pricing that has already been paid in their country. So, for example, if Pakistan had its own carbon pricing policy, that would mean that the producers here, aka the exporters, would be paying a carbon price for their products here. So, when they would export these goods into the EU, the price that they have already paid would be minused from their certificates. This reduction, requires importers to demonstrate that a carbon price has been effectively paid in a country of origin for the embedded emissions. At this point, the implications for businesses is that they must start tracking and calculating emissions data accurately. And non-compliance will result in penalties, making proactive compliance very crucial. So companies here may benefit from professional CBAM calculation services and verification to streamline their own processes. These steps that you can see on the screen now have been outlined by the European Commission and CBAM officials to help you facilitate a smooth trade for businesses inside and outside the EU and can help you adopt the CBAM system effectively. As we come to the end of our webinar almost, I would like to talk to you about a case study, how Steel Force successfully adopted CBAM compliance. So now let's look at a real-world example of a company that had to comply with CBAM, and let's see what Pakistani businesses can learn from this. Steel Force is a major steel trading company, and it was faced with an urgent challenge that they had to meet the EU's CBAM reporting deadline or risk penalties and trade restrictions from the EU. So, how did they do this? Well, to solve this challenge, they focused on three key areas. Number one, tracking emissions data. Number two, verifying its accuracy. And lastly, streamlining reporting. So by implementing this structured approach, Steel Force ensured compliance without disrupting trade and also securing its contracts in the EU. Steelforce has now successfully submitted its first CBAM declaration on time and is now ahead of its competitors in compliance readiness. So here what we can see is that companies that act early will avoid last-minute chaos and position themselves as reliable partners in the EU. And this case study shows us that companies that prepare in advance will benefit the most. Hence, Pakistani exporters must start tracking emissions, work with verifiers, and align with CBAM standards to avoid financial losses. CBAM compliance is very complex, but again, you don't have to do it alone. So Pakistani companies, I cannot stress enough that they must act now to stay competitive under CBAM And early action on sustainability, expert guidance, transparent records, and digital tracking will not only ensure compliance, but will also open doors to new opportunities. So if we adapt now, we can also thrive in the evolving global changing landscape. So these are some of the points that Resources Future recommends that can be key focus areas for exporters to develop a strategic roadmap for CBAM adoption. As we know, CBAM is not just a compliance requirement, it is now a catalyst for change in the global trade and climate policies. And businesses must understand its impact and adapt proactively to seize opportunities in the transition phase towards a low carbon economy. How Resources Future can help support your compliance journey? Well, Resources Future can help you with emission calculation services as well as assist you with adopting sustainable practices and reporting and verification. Adopting sustainable practices helps you alter your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, decreasing emissions overall. Lastly, we also provide workshops and trainings on CBAM requirements and key compliance areas. Thank you for attending today's webinar. I would now like to open the floor to any questions that you may have. Please use the chat box to share your questions. Thank you. So we have our first question from Asad Mahmood. He is asking what would be the fee charged to the industry from from the industry from CBAM declaration? Um, right. So what would be the fees charged to the industry for CBAM declaration? At the moment, they haven't specified these costs, but I think as you register, one would know. And again, exporters exporting to the EU will not have to do this step. I hope this was clear. Thank you, Asad. Any other questions? I would also just like to remind you guys that if we are unable to answer your questions, you can always feel free to, hit us up on LinkedIn and also email me. I shared my email at the beginning of this webinar, and I will also type it into our chat box here so that if anybody has any concerns or needs any kind of support, they can reach out to me. जी, so as I can see, Shakib Ilahi साहब ने एक question पूछा हुआ है. So to answer your question, at the moment, since the US has backed out, it is very unclear where it leaves us, which is why I mentioned that there are talks of CBAM implementation phase being moved on to 2027. And we are all guessing this is because they need to sort out their own political agendas. And so we will just have to wait and see what happens. Okay, so we have another question in the box. How to calculate scope 2 emissions when we import or use electricity or steam from other organizations? So I think the most basic answer to your question would be that scope 2 emissions are calculated for the product that is being exported. So, for example, if I was exporting a handbag, it would be कि I will have to see कि अच्छा handbag अब ये handbag बना है तो ये handbag की जो energy use हुई है बनने में ये कहाँ से आई थी coal burn हो रही थी oil use हो रहा था so I hope that answers your question. So, if anybody doesn't have any other questions, I think I will give the floor to Roma to conclude today's webinar. Once again, thank you everyone for being here today.
Thank you, Amara, for very insightful presentation. And thank you everyone who joined us today. This webinar is recorded and it will be available on our YouTube and LinkedIn. So you can access from there. And we have a series of webinars on other key topics, including CBAM, as well as GRI and IFRS S1, S2 and multiple other decarbonization related topics. So we'll be sharing information about them soon as well. So thank you, everyone. If there are no further questions, we end this webinar today.